Today, a friend of mine asked me to tell him a little bit about meditation. He was interested. He said, "I'm interested in meditation, but I've never done it before. I don't really know how to do it." And from what I've gathered, you might be someone I can ask. So I thought about it for a second or two. So, okay, how do I answer this question? What's going to be meaningful information? And I figured, okay, let's start with, why do we meditate? What use is it? What objective does it contribute towards? And so I think I put forward a supposition from, or started answering the question from that point of view, saying, look, really meditation can be a time in our day, in our week, in our life, where we find that there is another way of relating to life. We find that the standard feeling that we have about ourself in relation to the other and in relation to life and outcomes can change because we approach meditation with a specific attitude. And that attitude, because it's in a way, let's say, the objective for that 20 minutes or half an hour, is maybe easier to adopt in relation to meditation. And eventually, that attitude can start to make its way out of the meditation space and start to become, or start to replace, the alternate attitude and experience that we have of life. So if there is this different attitude in meditation, then I guess we need to know what that is, and that can be fostered if what happens in meditation is described, or and I always like the description of meditation is a time when we really don't have a job. When, if there is a job, it's to allow everything to be as it is. And the allowing everything to be as it is isn't something that we need to actively do, but it's the withdrawing from the activity of changing, of wanting to change, of wanting to get involved. And that allowing everything to be as it is for the time that you are in meditation. So I could start, or I could say that really meditation is about allowing everything to be as it is. Allowing your thoughts to be as they are, allowing your breathing to be as it is, allowing the barking dog to be as it is, allowing your reaction to the barking dog, if that's what happens, to be as it is. Which requires us to be encouraged that for that 10, 20 minutes, half an hour, everything else can wait. All of your other projects, all of your other important things in life can wait just for that time. Now, if 20 minutes is too long for the activities you've got going on to wait, maybe it's not the time to meditate. Maybe it's the time to get on with doing whatever is so important. if that's the case, an alternative to getting on and doing what's so important could be, okay, reduce your meditation to 10 minutes and say for 10 minutes, I don't need to worry about all these things that I'm going to do when I finish meditation. So either it's not the time to meditate, or reduce your meditation time to an amount of time that you feel, yes, I can put everything on hold for this long without my life coming to an end. Or you can sit in meditation and watch the thinking, allow the thinking that says, I shouldn't be sitting in meditation, I should be doing these other things, to be there and allow it to be there. Now, this attitude of allowing everything to be as it is a radically different attitude to the attitude we tend to have when we're living life. And so meditation is a learning, a cultivating of an attitude which hasn't really been cultivated. And it's not a learning by a learner that says, I'm going to make this happen. It's a learning by the absence of the learner that is going to make it happen, because the very activity or the very state that I'm talking about, the very way of being that I'm talking about, is, like so many things in spirituality, best described as the pulling the plug from an alternate way of being. And as the alternate way of being has the plug pulled from it, it slows down, and what we find as the destination or as the natural default resting place is this place of allowing everything to be as it is. So hard as that may seem to the doer attitude that says, okay, you've told me what the objective is, now I'm going to have to make it happen. So it's about switching gears in so much as even that doer that is so active in life needs to be seen as, well, there if it's there, but hopefully understood that meditation, when it happens, is the dissolving, the rolling back, the quietening down of that attitude. So we might find that we start off with a meditator. There is a meditator that wants to do meditation, wants to get good at meditation, wants to be the best at meditation, wants to be able to sit in meditation for 40 minutes so that it can be impressed that it sat in meditation for 40 minutes, and then it might want to meditate for an hour and 2 hours and become maybe the best meditator in its district, the one that meditates the longest, the most regularly, wakes up at the earliest time to meditate. And so that's an extreme, egoic meditator that thinks it's going to get merit from meditating the best. And we have been shaped by life, and if that's what's there, that's what's there. There isn't anyone to blame. It's something that is bound to happen if the belief in doership that is convinced that completeness and happiness in life is to be good at things, to get praise for things, to feel worthy because I have achieved something. And so even meditation can be hijacked, you could say, by this doer. And the irony is that it is the doer that is the antithesis of meditation. Until the doer dissolves, there really isn't true meditation. And having said that, true meditation may set in only if a meditator starts meditating. For us to assume that true meditation is the absence of the doer, and therefore if the doer meditates, or if the doer exists while meditation is being attempted, then there's no hope. That's also not necessarily the right way of looking at it, because we can go in starting off with there being a meditator, and in time it's the meditator that dissolves. And what's left when there is no meditator is just meditation happening. Now, maybe just to highlight how slippery this belief in personal doership can be, and doership and attachment to outcome, just these words that I'm putting forward, which the very content of them is talking about the end of the one that wants to meditate well. And yet, the doer is going to hear certain concepts, certain words strung together, and turn it into something for it to do. So it'll hear meditation is about allowing everything to be as it is, and allowing everything to be as it is the absence of the resisting what is. And so the doership will hear that, which is just a description. That is put forward as a description. It's not telling someone, do this. It's a description of what might happen when the meditator falls away. And yet, it's heard by the belief in doership in someone and says, okay, what I have to do is I have to stop resisting what is. And so the meditator, the doer, goes into meditation, sits there and thinking that is about a resistance to, let's say, sounds in the environment or aches in the body, that voice, that narrative may kick in. And then the meditator sees that voice, which is resistance to the present moment, because there might be resistance to the neighbor making noise or the dog barking or whatever. And then the meditator says, oh, this meditation is about the end of resisting what is, so I have to stop resisting what is, which in itself becomes a new resistance of what is. It becomes a resistance towards the resistance about the dog barking, for example. And if this isn't seen, the meditator feels like it's doing what it's meant to be doing in meditation. It says, well, I was told that meditation is about allowing everything to be as it is, and there are these thoughts which are not allowing everything to be as it is, so I have to fix that. I have to get rid of these thoughts that are resisting the dog barking. And that, as I've just said, is resistance towards the resistance. But it won't be seen as that, most likely, unless it's described as that. And if it's described as that, maybe the doer goes in to try and do something about the resisting thoughts, and then the understanding comes up and says, there's the resistance to the resistance. Just stop. The stop means allow the resistance to the dog barking be there. And at least now one layer of the ignorance, the habitual doership, which we think is getting us towards our goal, but in fact it's doing the opposite, not just in meditation, but in life in general, but we're looking at meditation where we can start to see the principle. And if we resist, it's quite possible that the doer will come in and go, oh, now I'm resisting the resistance. So let me stop resisting the resistance. And now there's another layer of resistance, a resistance about the resistance of the resistance. And it might just click in a moment that the only way for the resistance to be dealt with is to stop. In a way, this is a bit like trying to dig yourself out of a hole. It doesn't work. If you try to dig yourself out of a hole, you just end up in a bigger hole. And the habit, because we haven't realized this, the habit is, in the metaphor, is whenever there is a problem, you start digging, not realizing that the problem is that you're in a hole. And we've just grown up, developed in a way where digging is the answer. And someone needs to come along and say, hey, do you realize that your problem that you're trying to fix is that you're in a hole? Yes, I know, we might say. That's, well, I mean, we go, I might not have thought about it, but it's self-evident, isn't it? Well, yeah, you might say it's self-evident, but have you noticed that you're always trying to solve this self-evident problem by digging? And you might notice that it hasn't got you where you hope it would get you. And in fact, if you look closely, it may be intensifying the problem. And if our awareness lands on this, it's usually the only thing that is going to be useful to break the habit of digging. Now, that doesn't mean that because we've become aware of the fact that the problem is we're in a hole and our habit is to dig, which just gets us deeper into the hole, that doesn't mean that we're never going to dig as the solution again. However, if we find ourselves digging as the solution, there is the likelihood that a thought will arise going, there you go again, you're digging, stop. And so the answer is not to suddenly try and do filling in of the hole. Right? Maybe in the metaphor of getting out of the hole, that would be the answer. However, in the actual problem of doership, it isn't, because it is the problem of doership, it isn't about trying to do non-doership, because that's more doership. That's the equivalent of thinking or realizing the problem is that I keep digging, and then it's like, okay, let me do something different, but we find out that something different is more digging. So realizing that trying to resist the resistance, resist the suffering, is the same as the initial suffering, which is the resisting of the circumstance. And if that gets seen as a primary form of suffering, and if it gets seen to be the way that our psychological me operates in life, that click, that recognition, that seeing is what can now interfere with it in the effective way, which is, and the interference is just stop. Stop that incessant habit of trying to fix things in the usual way of trying to fix things, which is becoming convinced that the answer is in me controlling circumstance, instead of realizing that the answer is always an attitudinal quietness. So in this meditation space, if we go in and keep in mind it's just about allowing everything to be as it is, which means not even trying to do that. It couldn't really be simpler in a way, because there isn't a task. Why that's a paradox, and why we find that meditation, even though in theory it's simple, in practice it doesn't necessarily flow that easily, is simply because that habit of doing something is so strong. Now, in time, with awareness, where we might notice this getting involved habit, and just noticing it means that for a second or two we might be able to just pull the plug and fall backwards and just stop. And what we might find is experientially the meditation space gets quiet maybe after some time. Where this is useful is, imagine if before you sat down for meditation, there were all these problems, all of these things that you need to address. You know, the way that this person speaks to you in life, the fact that, you know, someone has, I don't know, decided they don't want to be your friend anymore, or a relationship is breaking up. And we might feel this tenseness, this attitude of resistance and uncomfortableness with circumstance. And that, by and large, is, on a mild or intense version of that, the way that we are forced to engage in circumstance based on how humans have developed and how the psychological me has been set in place. And as we sit in meditation, maybe for the first time, a shift happens in a way where it really gets noticed, where the mind is very active at first, and there is an allowing that to be there. And it might run out of juice after 3 or 4 or 5 or 10 minutes. And we find a dropping down into a more quiet place. And that's akin of connecting to the deeper part of who we are, the core of the human being that is outside of that incessant attitude of doership and attachment to outcome, the attitude that is always judging life and saying this is how it should and shouldn't be. And in that quietness, if we ask ourselves, is there a problem? We might find that we don't get an intellectual answer, but the actual feeling is, no, there is no problem. And that might become comparable to how we felt 10 minutes before, where, you know, this issue really needs to be dealt with, because until it's dealt with, things just aren't acceptable. The situation is just not acceptable. Life is not acceptable. And yet, just 10 minutes later of applying a different attitude to life, in this case, within the meditation space, we find that there is a very genuine, palpable contrastable difference about how we feel about the other person, about the situation, about life. Where we can be a bit perplexed at the fact that, wow, it really felt like there was a big issue that needed to be addressed. And now, in this different state of mind, connected to self rather than invested in this psychological me, there really doesn't seem like a problem. It's not personal. The situation isn't seen as an attack on who I am once there is a grounding into that deeper part of ourselves. So what we can start to conclude is there is this psychological me, this way of relating to life that takes everything personally, that feels like outcomes are very, very important to who I am. And it's about which part of ourself, the psychological me, that is based on essentially a false set of ideas about what we need in life and how life should or basically what we need in life and what life itself is and how it unfolds. There's either that attitude to life, the psychological me, which means we feel uncomfortable and feel like life needs to be fixed all the time, or we can find ourselves grounded in what we could call our essence, our true nature, our core, where the priorities change. Well, I won't even use the word priorities, where the sense of self, what we are, is essentially a completely different identity that feels less challenged by what's happening on the surface. And that's the difference between suffering and uncomfortableness with oneself, uncomfortableness with the other, which is really an uncomfortableness with oneself, and it's an uncomfortableness of the psychological self, versus a groundedness in your essence, where the flow of life is inconsequential to who you really are. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't try to change the flow of life in the moment if there is something we can clearly do to make it better. If that's the case, if you see $50 on the ground, you can pick it up. If there's clearly no one around, well, it's a win. $50 on the ground, it's yours. Or if there's an office or something, you can hand it in. If there are people around, you can ask, who's this? Who does this belong to? If a water pipe is broken, knowing that the water pipe isn't an attack on who you are doesn't mean that another part of yourself, the pragmatic part of yourself, doesn't try to fix the problem so that circumstance is more pleasurable. However, being connected to the core of yourself knows that if you can't fix the problem, if you can't fix your leaking water pipe, it's circumstance and it's going to mean inconvenience, cost. And yet that doesn't create an uncomfortableness where we lose connection with the part of ourself that says, this is life and I am. Now, to the psychological self, none of these words that I'm saying, are true. When the psychological self is in full flight, let's assume that the words don't dissolve the psychological self, and the words are heard by the maintaining the psychological self that continues to maintain itself in that moment. Nothing about what I'm saying seems accurate or relevant to the psychological me. I'm saying, that's not so important. The psychological me is in flight or fight because to it, the look that the person gave the psychological me is very important. You know, I can't have people looking at me like that and getting away with it, would be what the psychological me is saying. And so the description that, you know, circumstances not primary, outcomes are not primary, just doesn't make sense to the psychological self. So something needs to kick in, something needs to set in, some pointers need to start coming into the system that hopefully shift us out of this psychological self, at least sometimes, to allow a seeing of things from a different perspective. Now, if that doesn't happen, then that's destiny. And there's plenty of human destinies that are such that one has to live the rest of one's life from the perspective of the psychological me. But for some of us, being exposed to the information that says peace of mind, being grounded in the core of who you are, is a potentiality in this life, is something available to us. Just that information can be very significant. Why can it be significant? Because we change, we learn when something is important to us. When something is a problem. So the way the brain sort of works is when something is hot, attention goes onto it. Now, I don't mean physically hot, but I mean hot, meaning we see that there is a problem, there is a gap between where we would like to be and where we are, let's say. And unfortunately, what the brain has been habituated to think is hot and requires our attention is the gap between our preferences and what is actually delivered in life. And so there are a lot of people that are very good at fixing problems because attention goes on to that problem. So fixing circumstantial problems, because the brain picks it up as a that there is a entropy, there is a motivation comes out of this this pushback from life. If there's no pushback between two components of life, like the circumstance and our preference, and in this case I'm really talking our preference and our attachment to preference, because we say this is what is most important, then there'd be no reason to change anything. So the fact that we move forward in life is because of this entropy gap that inspires movement, inspires attention, and brings attention to a topic. So hearing the words that peace of mind is available can bring attention to something that didn't present in a way previously that seem to require attention. That means that our uncomfortableness in life gets projected out onto circumstance. And so instead of seeing the uncomfortableness as the problem, what happens is we look at the circumstance and all our efforts go into trying to change the circumstance. Whereas if we're told that suffering is a state of mind, a way of being, that it is the normal experience of humans in life, we have developed such that suffering and uncomfortableness with life is very normal, and there is this alternative. And this alternative is about the best change that we can have in life, because it means that there will be peace as opposed to suffering as a general principle towards whatever is happening in life. And whatever is happening in life means all of life. Whenever you're awake, if this change happens, it's an in-principle change, that moves us from feeling uncomfortable with life because of this psychological me that is in place, that is bound to feel uncomfortable in life, because life essentially is a threat to its existence in any moment. And there's a shift to the falling away of the psychological me, such that our attitude to life changes radically. And in principle, our attitude is one of understanding that the flow of life is sometimes pleasure and sometimes pain, that is not going to change, and that our efforts to change circumstance should be such that we do what we can, knowing that the outcome is not in our control. Instead of doing what we can, insisting that the outcome is what we would like because we believe that's what the problem is. So a shift of attention can happen from circumstance to suffering versus peace of mind. Now, hopefully, this doesn't turn into an attachment where we feel like I'm attached to having peace of mind and there is a strong resistance to suffering because it has been described as suboptimal. Suffering has been described as a suboptimal way of being in life, not done suboptimally by the person, because the general principle that's often described is we are not the doer. We have been designed by life, and life is bringing in new information that hopefully changes us. So life has designed us up to this point such that we function very optimally compared to, let's say, less evolvedness, and yet suboptimally relative to what's available. At first, there might be attachment, but that will be seen, where we see that if there is a resistance to suffering when it comes up, that's just more suffering. And just as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk in relation to meditation, if that becomes how we hear the teaching, then we can see how the doer has grabbed onto this notion of peace of mind versus suffering, has said, I want only peace of mind, I don't want suffering, that's suboptimal, and I am going to do peace of mind, and therefore if suffering comes up, I'm going to resist it. And that resistance is more suffering, and so at some point it will be seen, and that movement starts dropping away. If we can hold the description of peace of mind and the description of suffering as just descriptions of how life happens from time to time, no one doing it, then that's very useful, because we have the description of what can be, but without an attachment to it, because we understand if we psychological attach to that description, then that's going to lead to suffering, which is more of what ultimately we're hearing can end. And so you might ask, well, what's the benefit then of having the description? And the benefit is to know that it's available, to know that that is a problem that we can put our attention on, but hopefully to do that without attachment to outcome. So if you look at the Four Noble Truths in Buddhism, the first noble truth, life is suffering. That is attention being brought to the fact that we suffer. The second noble truth, there is a way out of suffering. So now, if those two noble truths have set in, our interest might be, oh yes, this is what I think I'm interested in. I have a motivation to dedicate time to dedicate energy to. There's so many paradoxes or nuances in suffering that teachings need to have so many tools in their arsenal to deal with the different errors, psychological, mental, intellectual errors that lead to suffering. And I'm a big fan of saying that the seeker themselves needs to understand why the teachings are saying certain things. If the seeker becomes more and more familiar with why a teaching is saying something, it's less likely to relate to the teaching as some absolute truth, and then understand the methodology. And in understanding the methodology, it also gets to understand the problem that the methodology is dealing with. And it may see that there are 4 or 5 problems, which really means different ways that suffering can manifest. And each of the different ways has a different root dynamic to it. So let's say blame is hatred and judgment and the belief of doership towards the other for what they have done that has delivered pain to us. Guilt is the attitude of doership and hatred towards ourself for what actions have happened that we see as my actions that have delivered pain. So you can see there's a slight, although it's a common basis for the suffering, there is a difference. One is blame towards the other, and one is blame towards ourselves. In this case, they're both blame, which is both based on the belief in personal doership. However, when we look at attachment, we see that attachment is the insistence on life being pleasure, 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 with the belief that my happiness is to be found in outcomes. Now that fundamentally is an attitude, a way of relating to circumstance that is different to the attitude of blame. And so the teachings will say certain things within the overall teaching that are dealing with the attachment dynamic, and other things which deal with the doership dynamic. And then within the attachment dynamic, there could be 5 or 6 different forms of attachment to outcomes. And so there will be different concepts in the teaching that, and different things said that deal with each of the different forms of suffering. Now, if we aren't clear on that, we're bound to mix up all of the different concepts. And when we hear something said in a different teaching using different language, it may be the equivalent of something said in another teaching that is said a little differently. But with a bit of understanding, we can start to see that it's pointing at the same suffering dynamic of, let's say, attachment. And if we can see that, then the two teachings sort of come to support each other, because we say, oh yeah, this teaching is talking about that problem in this way and it uses these metaphors, and this other teaching talks about the same problem from a slightly different angle, using different languages, using different metaphors, but I can see the same theme beneath it. And we might wonder why teaching says things that seem contradictory. So on the one hand, it says, look, you can't do anything. You're not the doer. There is nowhere to go. All there is this. And another teaching might say, look, you have free will, and you are a co-creator in life, and you are the one that has to put in the effort. So you go, which one of those is right? And it's very confusing. It can even be that in the same teaching, that one day you hear the teacher saying this, and the next day, or next week, you hear them say something else that sounds contradictory. Now, if we come to see that each of those explanations are dealing with different parts of the psychological me, maybe someone's psychological me has taken the idea of nothing to do in a way where they're not even addressing circumstance in a pragmatic way, which means addressing circumstance without attachment to outcome, which is the important part. And because a seeker might have heard there's nothing to do, that might have sunk in a way that interferes with a pragmatic functioning of life, or with a pragmatic functioning that considers the other as being important. So we might hear everything is destiny, and therefore we go, oh, in that case, I can steal things, I can play loud music at night because it's all destiny. Now that is destiny if it happens, and if a seeker hears the concept like that and steals and whatever, that's destiny. And it is destiny, it's exactly that. It's the seeker receiving new conditioning from life, that new conditioning setting in a particular way based on the seeker's genes and up-to-date conditioning, and the misunderstanding of what the teaching is saying sets in, and the seeker then finds themselves being irresponsible in life, which is not what the true understanding would lead to. And so if that's the case, and in some teachings that is bound to happen, and so either that teaching or another teaching will address that specifically and say to them, no, you are the one that has to live as if you are the doer in pragmatic terms, that there are consequences to your actions even though you're not the doer. And that description can sound like it's a contradiction to there's nothing to do, everything is happening according to God's will. And yet, if we understand that it's those two different explanations are dealing with different forms of suffering, then it becomes understandable. It's like, oh, I see why what seemed like contradictions are not in fact contradictions, because they're dealing with different psychological aspects that require different pointers to undo them. So one of the most important types of change that needs to happen, as far as what the seeker needs to understand, is the different forms of suffering. Because if we don't understand that attachment is a form of suffering, then we'll hear a teaching, it will describe peace of mind or enlightenment, liberation, And if it describes it in a way that is practical, which means a way that the intellect can understand and grab hold of, then it's quite likely that the doership is going to take that pragmatic description of, let's say, peace of mind being the end of suffering, and turn it into an expectation, turn it into an attachment. And at least if we've understood that one of the forms of suffering, and peace of mind is the end of suffering. So one of the forms of suffering is attachment. And so if we're seeking peace of mind and we have become attached to the notion of the end of suffering, that is a bit like a dog chasing its tail. And it's only if we have been reminded that attachment, even to liberation, is a form of suffering, which means for as long as that attachment persists, the freedom from suffering is not going to be there. Now, if we're not given that description of attachment being a form of suffering, or we haven't heard it and we haven't become clear on it, that means that our attachment to enlightenment is likely to be there, because that's how we've been designed by default up to this point in time. So we're bound to get attached to the notion of peace of mind versus suffering and not realize that that is a form of suffering. Now, in a different teaching that uses a different approach, because it's understood that if you give the mind a pragmatic explanation that it can grab hold of, it's going to turn it into an expectation and an attachment. So in another teaching that has decided, I'm not going to give the mind pragmatic explanations, because if I give it pragmatic explanations, it's going to turn it into an attachment. So I will talk about truth instead of the end of suffering or peace of mind. So, and this is very valid. I'm trying to point out the different methodologies and why they do it, and why we can start to, if we understand suffering and the human dynamic more clearly, we can then start to understand teachings. And as we start to understand teachings better, our understanding of the problem and the solution goes deeper and deeper. So one teaching says, look, I want to equip the intellect to understand the playing field better, because I believe that that is going to lead to the end of suffering, especially if the playing field, which includes a very important component of it, is suffering itself in the different types. So if I put in explanations of the different types of suffering, eventually I have confidence that for those seekers who absorb the descriptions and then find awareness in the intellect picking up what is described and seeing the attachment if it's happening, then it will get cut off naturally. Other teachings say, look, I'll leave that approach up to you. Instead, the approach I'm going to take is to not describe it in pragmatic daily living terms, but rather in abstract terms. And in abstract terms, we won't talk about liberation as the end of suffering. In abstract terms, we'll say nothing changes in liberation. In liberation, misery is going to be there as much as it was there before. Life as it was is going to be there as it was before. Don't have any illusions that anything magnificent is going to change. Or rather, don't have any illusions that there's going to be some change that is going to lead to some magnificence, some improvement in the situation. Let's say, it's not about becoming a better person. It's not about peace of mind. It's not about a quiet mind or any of these things. Liberation is simply about knowing yourself truly. And whatever other descriptions are given. So you can see that, maybe you can see, hopefully you can see, the teaching has understood that attachment to outcomes is the modus operandi of the doership, and doership is the problem. Doership is the thing that gets in the way of liberation. So the teaching says there's nothing to have. There's no one there to get it. And so whenever you find yourself thinking that it's about peace of mind, or thinking that it's about bliss, or thinking it's about oneness, understand that that's all ignorance. That liberation is about knowing your true nature, and your true nature is witness, witnessing consciousness, the simple awareness of what is. Not needing anything to be different. Just know yourself truly as the witness. Now, you might be able to see that that teaching is undermining attachment to outcome by doing something very different to what the teaching I'm putting forward, let's say. But they're the same teaching. They're not the same teaching. They're moving towards the same outcome, doing it differently. So it's addressing attachment to outcome by saying it isn't, there is going to be virtue, there's no change. Enlightenment is not about any change on the level of the body or on the mind. It's about simply waking up to who you are. And if you think it's about change, then you think it's about time, you think it's about space, you think that you're the body. And all of that is illusion. So if this isn't understood, you can hear one teaching, and then the other teaching talks about giving descriptions. And so if we take one teaching as right and wrong, let's say we take the esoteric, abstract teaching that says, look, there's nowhere to go, nothing's going to change, it's simply about waking up to who you are. That's liberation. Not saying why it's about who you are or what you'll get, right? For very good reason. That's the whole point of the teaching, is to say, there is something important, and that's just to know who you are, but it's not going to change anything. You know, at some point, not to find that teaching wrong, but because in this teaching we'll say, what's the point? The point is something needs to change, otherwise what's the point about knowing who you are? And so that comes in not as a criticism of that teaching, but rather as an emphasis of this teaching and saying, okay, so what is the practical change? The practical change is peace of mind. The practical change, peace of mind, is not the gain of anything, right? So there is, now we start to see where there's some overlap, but it's the absence of suffering. And what is suffering? Suffering is attachment to outcome. So now we see more overlap. So it's saying peace of mind, but don't turn peace of mind into something. And realize that peace of mind is the end of attachment. Peace of mind is the end of the doership belief that is trying to be the one that makes it happen. And so I hope, you know, when I talk about two teachings, I know it can be confusing as I jump from one to the other. Hopefully there's little bits in there that become clear and juxtapose each other to point out where the common ground is. And the common ground, if it's seen between two teachings, means that in that moment, something can kick in and go, it's attachment to outcome that is being addressed when the teaching says, there is nothing that's going to change. You'll be as miserable. There will be as much misery after liberation as there was before, but there'll be no one there to be miserable. There'll just be misery happening. Now, as I've said all the time, all along, often, whatever is put forward in the teaching is not the truth, it's a concept. So, I would say if we wanted to get down and pull apart the concepts, we can pull apart any concept because it can't be holistic. A concept is pretty narrow. And whatever you say about something from one angle isn't true from another angle. And so I would say, well, actually, to me, liberation is the end of suffering. So there won't be as much misery as there was before, especially if we're talking about psychological misery, because the whole point is that enlightenment is the end of suffering. But that's not making that description wrong, because I can see that it's saying, look, if there's misery, be the one that is witnessing the misery rather than the one that is miserable. And how do we be the one that is witnessing? In fact, the one that is witnessing, these are words, is the end of even the one witnessing, where there is just witnessing happening, witnessing as witnessing awareness. And how does that happen? It happens when the narrative that is resisting the suffering falls away. And in the dissolving of the resistance of the suffering, what we might find is that there is a witnessing of suffering as an object, as a thought object, let's say, or a feeling object. And how does that narrative of involvement in the suffering fall away? When our intellect says, liberation is just about knowing who I am, and that is described in the teaching as formless awareness, and that enlightenment, liberation, is not about life being different. It's not about anything changing. And so that concept, which I say is not so accurate from a certain angle, is very accurate from another angle and very appropriate as a teaching. It will allow a witnessing of the suffering rather than a resistance of the suffering, which is another layer of suffering. Eventually, the capacity to witness suffering, which means space on the outer level, will penetrate inward, such that there will be eventually the capacity to witness pleasure and pain of life without the primary suffering happening. So eventually, the teaching that says enlightenment is not about the end of suffering leads to the end of suffering. So we need to understand, why are these things being said? If we don't get to understand what the journey is about in pragmatic terms, I think what we have to then pray for is the teaching doing its work simply by essentially hypnotizing us into different phases. Or not necessarily hypnotizing us, but convincing us to relate to things differently, not necessarily because of pragmatic, accurate descriptions, but rather because of concepts that are very effective at running interference in the problem. Hopefully you can see the distinction thing. And be very clear, I am extremely impressed and what's the word? Well, let's just put it use the word impressed at seeing how teachings, even 1,000-year-old teachings, especially 1,000, 2,000, 3,000-year-old teachings, understood the mechanics of psychology and developed solutions to that. And those solutions understood that it's not all about accuracy, it's not all about detail, it's not all about pragmatism. In fact, at certain phases, it has to be about the opposite of that. It has to be about using blunt force in a way to break the shell, let's say. It's a bit like, if you're demolishing a house, you need to go in with a sledgehammer, and you can worry about, using a brush or something like that at another stage, once all the bricks have been broken and removed, and then you're, let's say, I don't know, raking the garden or something. So you have to use appropriate tools at the appropriate time. So just in summary, before we take some questions, I will just summarize that these talks are about something very specific. They're always about the same topic. That topic is about happiness in daily life for the human being in this life. Happiness is not happiness through outcomes. That's where life has conditioned us and designed us to think happiness is to be found. When I talk about happiness, I'm not talking about pleasure or joy or gaining better circumstance. I'm talking about happiness that is actually, when we end up finding ourselves happy, it's not at all what we expected. It turns out to be happiness through unbroken peace of mind. And peace of mind and suffering are always on the level of our attitude to circumstance, our attitude to the flow of life, and not the pleasure or pain of the flow of life itself. What is the attitude that leads to suffering and uncomfortableness? It's the attitude of personal doership and attachment to outcome, which really means there's a psychological me that believes itself to be in control of everything it thinks, says, feels, and does, and acts. And that psychological me believes that its completeness and its happiness is to be found in circumstance, in outcomes, in essentially life being pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. And what is the alternative attitude that comes about when life has reconditioned us in such a way that the old attitude dissolves? Well, the alternative attitude is an attitude we can call the attitude of non-doership and non-attachment. But let's be clear that that attitude of non-doership and non-attachment is not a new psychological me that believes my happiness is not to be found in outcomes, because then we will essentially be the one resisting outcomes. But rather, this new attitude is simply the absence of the belief my happiness is to be found in outcomes. That the absence of the belief that I am the doer that has to make life happen, that is in control of my thoughts and my feelings, and therefore I have to feel guilt, I have to feel blame, I have to feel pride, I have to feel worry and anxiety, I have to feel expectation. So those are the two attitudes. One leads to a resistance to life, the other leads to an allowing life to flow. And we let life flow. We realize that we're being lived. We are an expression of life. The human being in each moment is a result of its makeup, and its makeup is very complex. We have amazingly complex biological systems that constitute who we are on a biological level, and the psychological me stems out of that, the biological brain, which is part of the body, and all of that is a result of our genes, which genes really means the genetic blueprint that grows and turns into what we are on a sort of hardware level, and how that hardware is conditioned by life from the moment it's conceived right up to this very moment, and continued to be conditioned, shaped by new conditioning. So the talks now that I'm putting forward are just new conditioning. So conditioning is not really the problem. conditioning is a problem when it's the conditioning that puts in place the belief of doership and attachment to outcome that forces us to relate to circumstance with guilt and blame and pride and so on. And so life can deliver new conditioning that can radically change our up-to-date conditioning, which means in an instant or over an extended period of time, the belief in doership and attachment to outcome gets worn away. And it gets worn away when our working mind, which is part of our intellect, absorbs the concepts, which, as I've described, are very pragmatic explanations of a lot of things relative to happiness in daily living. And not only absorbs it as information, it's not much use if it's just information, because the test is not that we can write out long essays that sound very nice and are in good handwriting and all of that. The real benefit is when the suffering stops arising. Now, the suffering stops arising when the psychological me dissolves, and the psychological me dissolves when the intellectual understanding starts to go deeper and deeper and deeper, and it does that when we find ourselves automatically investigating and seeing the dynamics that were always there in life, but that we had no interest in, that we weren't equipped to recognize. And now we start recognizing them, and we might see, oh, that's pain in the moment, that's pleasure in the moment. Here's my attitude of attachment to the pleasure and the pain. Here's my attitude of blame towards the other for what I see that they have done as the doer, and that they should have done it differently. And we might have a thought that arises, actually, how could they possibly have done it differently? They are a result of this very complex genetic structure that's grown into a person that has been conditioned by life. They find themselves in a circumstance and they operate automatically. And I am the same way, that whatever is happening through me in each moment is a happening and not my doing. Whatever is happening through the other is a happening and not their doing. And this might allow us to see all of life as a happening, all of life as a predestined story from beginning of time to the end of time, unfolding in the now, but essentially already existing. And if our attitude is an attitude of understanding that in each moment that is destiny unfolding the only way it could have. We know how it is destined only once it happens. So Stephen Hawking had written an essay, "Is life predetermined?" ? And the first sentence is, yes, it is. However, knowing that life is predetermined doesn't allow us to know what is predetermined. So that means that, often if someone hears the concept that life is predetermined, they say, oh, in that case, what's the point? And usually the question of what's the point is coming from the doer that wants to feel like it has done whatever happens in the future so that it can feel good about itself. And so if it hears, oh, life is predetermined, then it says, well, if that's the case, I can't claim credit for it. And so if I can't claim credit for it, it says, what's the point? Because its modus operandi is to succeed in such a way that it believes that if I succeed, then I will be loved. And so the very notion that life is predetermined, to it says, oh, that's a game changer. I mean, I can't see any point in trying. It's a bit like someone saying, well, let's play sport, but the result already exists. And whatever you do isn't going to affect it, which is not what the notion of predetermination is really saying. So there's several misconceptions in that attitude that says, what's the point? One is the presupposition that the point is about achieving and taking it personally. And if that's the case, predetermination would really mean not much point playing. However, what if the point is not to win, not to achieve such that we will then be loved. But what if the point of life is to experience? Now, you get to experience whether it's predetermined or not, whether you are the doer or whether you're not the doer. There is still experience. And what if the point of life is to experience life? And what if there are other meaningful factors that can present in life, even in the absence of what we assume is meaning, i.e., when we assume it's about doership and achievement, the meaning seems to be about winning, about being the best. What if that meaning crumbles because it never was about that, and yet there is other meaning that we haven't considered? So I suggest that that is the purpose, or there is another purpose, and that is to just be, to experience life for the sake of life, not for the sake of outcomes. And, we've got that proverb says, enjoy the journey and not the destination. So that's pointing to this very fact. It's not about getting somewhere, but it's about being here. And what's the other misconception and what's the point? Oh, and the point is that even if it is predetermined, we don't know what's coming next. So we're going to be surprised, we're going to be excited. And furthermore, what is predetermined only unfolds through the mechanics or mechanism of everyone each moment doing exactly what they think or feel to do. Now, whatever they think or feel to do is predetermined. However, in practice, the gift of free will, which is the feeling that we have that says, whatever I do is what I chose to do, means that even though it is predetermined, we don't know what is predetermined, and what is predetermined only comes about by each of us participating by doing exactly what we think or feel to do, which in fact is what we were destined to do. Because when we look at it, we find that whatever we think or feel to do is based on our genes and up-to-date conditioning, two factors we weren't in control of, and the circumstance we find ourselves in, also something we weren't in control of. And the unique combination of all of those micro factors results in a thought and an action, a decision to do whatever we do. So from that point of view, God's will and my will are not two, but two sides of the one coin. And so from one perspective, in each moment, you are living life based on whatever you think or feel to do. And from another perspective, you are being lived. That life is living you based on having designed you and continually designing you a particular way in each moment. So we'll take some questions. Hi, Holger.
Roger, I just want to say I love you.
Thank you. That's very nice.
In an
I love you.
impersonal way, and it's so beautiful. Your clarity and precision and playfulness. I really enjoy it and deeply resonate with it. And just sometimes I feel a little guilty that I don't ask you more intelligent questions, but that's okay. And that's just the way it is right now. Because it seems so precious, the opportunity just to ask you things that maybe for years or my whole life were just stuck in my thinking. And just right now, I cannot access them, and to ask maybe how to look at it in a different way. But I trust wholeheartedly that everything is working out in a beautiful way.
That's beautifully said. I actually take that as a compliment. If the questions fall away, that's the freedom. So if you find yourself without a question making itself very clear, that is possibly because in this moment the question is not so relevant.
Thank you so much. As so many, so much guilt, so much heaviness is just being seen, and just the seeing by itself is already the joy and the freedom. I mean, I just feel I'm just happy. I'm just happy right now, and I'm not attached to my happiness either, because I just want to thank you, and I just stop now. Otherwise, I create more trouble for myself. Thank you, and see you again.
Thank you, Holger. On that note, I was speaking with someone today, and I think they would agree that they have some fairly high benchmarks on themselves, some high expectations, and the one of the ingrained ideas they have is that they need to earn the fact that they are alive. You know, it's something that you need to earn by your contribution. And the sense I get as I hear this is that expectation, that concept or belief even, is a belief that keeps us from relaxing into a flow of life. And it makes sense that that's in place, especially if we've found ourselves coming through certain conditioning in life, through family or through society, that probably innocent in a way, but manipulative in another way. Humans being attached to pleasure will say things to children, for example, or citizens that are useful to get a child maybe to behave a certain way. And so, you know, if we're a parent might use sort of, it's a psychological trick to get a child to behave a certain way. And so if this is drummed into you that you need to be grateful, you need to earn your life, then what that can do is embed as part of our makeup, part of our genes and up-to-date conditioning, the expectation that I need to live a certain way, that I should do this and I shouldn't do that. And what that can do is get in the way of us being with what is. Because if we're feeling tired, if we happen to be ill, or find ourselves with certain preferences, the expectation of how we should be can get in the way of allowing us to relax into maybe what is more alignment with life. That alignment might be staying in bed for the day because you're sick. You might be chronically sick, and that might require a surrender to the fact that, okay, my life, because I have a certain condition, means I can't function, I can't live like the majority of other people. I might not be able to hold down a job. And so if we're conditioned with the shoulds and shouldn'ts, there's going to be a great conflict between our circumstance, which let's say in this case is our health, and our expectation or our wish, our desire to perform differently in life. And for as long as that stays in place, we're going to resist the illness. As soon as we drop our expectation, this load of guilt falls away. And so what I mentioned to this friend today was just as a juxtapose to what we had spoken about over several weeks, about being a part of her psychological identity. And to make the point, I said, if God is cheering you on to surrender to not contributing in those moments when you're not able to contribute. So God is there saying, maybe today she'll just stay in bed for as long as is needed. Maybe today. Come on, you can do it. And then the attitude sits in and says, I have to be productive, I have to contribute, I have to earn my my life. And so out of bed they get. And God goes, oh, nearly, maybe tomorrow. And then tomorrow comes, and the thought arises, maybe I'm meant to be in bed. Maybe that's what is needed of me, or that's where my alignment would be. And so then she stays in bed because that's what it feels like for as long as it feels appropriate. And that's when God's going, yes, you did it. You know, that's God is there, never saying you're not good enough. That's the psychological me that says that. And that psychological me will project that onto and create a God that in turn says it back, saying, you know, you're not good enough. Whereas the God that I know, and it's not actually, I'll make it clear that I'm using this God is chair as a metaphor, really. If there is a God, it's a God principle, and the God principle, let's say, God principle is love. But love in this teaching is the absence of hatred, and the absence of hatred means the absence of judgment, and the absence of judgment is the understanding that life is unfolding exactly as it's meant to unfold. Which means if tiredness or illness is put in place, then a corresponding way of functioning in life will be there. And to the extent that there is a resistance in that functioning, then God understands that. The principle of acceptance understands that the resistance to having to stay in bed and therefore not staying in bed is there, and so that's what's going to happen. And so God will wait for the time and not insist that resistance falls away. But when the resistance falls away, then there's an excitement, you could say, from God, because the person's attitude is now mirroring God's attitude. So God's attitude was love. So no judgment even for the person forcing themselves out of bed. It was understood. But the resistance can be seen. And so that's why I say God is waiting for the day when that resistance falls away in the person, in us. And that, you could say, is God consciousness. The dissolving of the resistance. So no need to feel guilty. God will never judge us. Society will judge us. We'll judge ourselves. And God says, you've done a terrific job. Hi, Marianne.
Hi, Roger. Nice to see you. I just thank you so much once again. Your teachings are amazing, and hearing it over and over again. I don't know why this didn't occur to me, but that's new conditioning, and that's why I'm so drawn to listen to you over and over and over again. Even the same teaching over again. And this talk you gave today was so apropos because I have a lot of guilt and anxiety about outcomes. And I've heard you say this that my happiness is not to be found in the pleasurable things of life. And
Mm-hmm.
I realized that, oh, the psychological me really thinks that it is. And
Mm-hmm.
only recently, I was able to pull, I don't know, I'm going to say it like this, pull back and see that the psychological me never achieves anything. It never gets to the end of anxiety or worry. And there's always the next thing. It never just, it never achieves anything. And that just kind of redirected me to see, oh yeah, that's that constant chasing. And
Mm-hmm.
that it just shifted something that I could see. Oh, then what's the alternative? And I just found myself wanting to um, face the anxiety, almost a curiosity or a willingness to just be there for it. So I'd like to
Mm-hmm.
get your perspective on that. I'll stop there. Thank you.
You're welcome. Yes, well, I mean, what you describe as an insight, right, is in a particular moment, something that wasn't seen before is seen. And in fact, usually these insights are we see something that has been there presenting itself day after day after day after day for our whole life. For whatever reason, essentially destiny, it isn't seen until that moment it's seen. Now, we might think that that is my doing, that, oh, I saw it, but the truth is you didn't see it, any day before that. And so on a particular day, it becomes seen as a result of, well, let's just say either God's will or your genes and up-to-date conditioning. And it's seeing these dynamics in a different light. So you've seen, well, actually, and this is a great one, what you described it. The psychological me is convinced, and we should see this, not mixing it up with our the understanding that is setting in, because sure, what tends to happen are there are two parts of the system existing simultaneously, where on a conscious level we've heard and we're starting to understand my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes. So if someone said, do you think your happiness is to be found in outcomes? And we'd answer, no, I don't. Happiness is not to be found there. But if we really look at the responses from the ingrained me, that's where we get the real hints that say, oh, actually, on a deep level, underneath the deepening understanding that my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes, actually, my system really truly believes it. I see it when I get caught up in, trying to find happiness. And I then see what is unfolding, what movements are in place. I go, wow, on this level, I completely believe that my happiness is to be found in a relationship. And that's what I'm secretly craving. Even when I say my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes, deep down, I really believe it is. And to see that and not get confused with just because we know it on some other level, that we know that my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes, to see that, oh, as well as knowing it on this level, I don't know it, or I believe the opposite on this other level. That insight, that seeing it, means the understanding has just gone a whole lot deeper. Because what was probably happening is that the ignorance that remained was hidden. And what we might say is, I completely understand that my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes. And that's a misassessment, a wrong assessment of what's actually going on. You know, we say, I completely understand my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes. And I go, no, I'm pretty sure you don't.
Right.
Assuming someone says, oh, so if I say, do you still have suffering arising? Yes, could be the answer. I still do have suffering arising from time to time, but I completely understand that my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes. And I go, no, you don't. Now, this is not a criticism. I think you need to understand that if you completely understood, suffering wouldn't arise. So even if we just change it, the wording for ourselves and say, on some level, I see that my happiness isn't to be found in outcomes, but on another level, I must still believe happiness is to be found in outcomes because suffering still arises. Now that's a start, but what you're describing is the actual seeing, where you go, I see it happening. So it is there. And then you also see, and it hasn't ever delivered. I've been following that belief for 30, 40, 50, 60 years. Presumably after an extended period of time, we have achieved some of the outcomes that we were convinced would deliver us happiness. And after enough times, hopefully our intellect clicks and says, I know the pleasure of achieving outcomes. I've had that time and time again, and it's never delivered an ongoing, lasting happiness. So at what point do I stop saying, oh, well, the next pleasure is going to be the winning number? At what point do I consider, well, actually, maybe it hasn't delivered ongoing, lasting happiness because it's not to be found in pleasures, in outcomes. So these insights, these clicks that we have to have for ourselves, hopefully inspired by the pointers, by the teachings, by the concepts, but ultimately they need to arise for ourselves, and that's the understanding going deeper and deeper.
Thank you.
Have you got your microphone muted or?
Oh, I was just thinking, thank you. I was just enjoying it. Appreciate that. Over.
Very good. Thank you. Hi, Mark.
Hi, Roger. Good evening to you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Good
morning to you.
I loved tonight. Putting yourself in the audience. Imagine, if you will, that you're listening to all this. What question might you have?
Well, I thought about this yesterday in a hypothetical God question. Like if God came down and said, what would you like to know? This was inspired after listening to a podcast on artificial intelligence. And obviously there's a lot of unknown questions when it comes to developing artificial intelligence that sort of some clarity on would help these scientists, these computer whizzes develop, what to them is a very important movement. And so I guess the right answer for me, or the right question for me, if God said, "What would you like to know?" I think I would ask, I'd like the piece of information that is going to be most useful. And so not in relation to, I wouldn't narrow it down in relation to artificial intelligence. Even if I was my job was developing artificial intelligence, and God said, "What would you like to know?" I think my answer is, I'd like to know the piece of information, or well, if the hypothetical is, what would you like to know? I'd say whatever is most useful. And so essentially, that's what you asked me: is what is most useful?
Yes.
Right? Yeah. And I'd have to say that it's what's in the talks. Because I say, these talks are about one thing: happiness for the human being in this life. I am very confident that from a certain perspective, that is the most important quest and the most important outcome that can be bestowed on a human being: peace of mind in daily living. And so the talks deliver everything that is relevant, or not necessarily everything, but the talks always revolve around those components that are relevant for peace of mind in daily living. So given there are these body of talks, I would say, my answer is the talks. If someone wanted it narrowed down, it would be about picking a segment out of the talks. And so just the very beginning part that says what we're really looking for, whether we realize it or not, is happiness in daily life. And happiness in daily life is continuous, unbroken peace of mind. That's a hugely important piece of information. But if I left it at that, and said that's the most important, it is. It's a starting point that says, okay, according to that concept, what we're really looking for, meaning what will really satisfy, whether we know it or not, is liberation. And liberation, essentially, in practical terms, means unbroken peace of mind. And unbroken peace of mind means the end of suffering. So that's good information to have. Otherwise, we're going to be on a quest for all sorts of things. So I hope that answers your question.
Was that the answer you got yesterday while imagining putting that question to God?
Well, I lost interest after just saying that's the question I would ask. And it was inspired by, I think, them saying, what question would you ask God? And when I heard that, I thought to myself, well, actually, I would just want to know what is most important for me to know. And because of peace of mind, I feel like that question has been answered. So I didn't really feel like I was looking for an answer in a way. But essentially, if I was a seeker, that's the question I would ask: what is most important for me to know? And if someone asked me what is most important for me to know, I'd say, listen to one of the talks. And that about summarizes it. And if someone wants something, oh yeah, but give it to me in a sentence, I'd say, what we're really looking for, whether we realize it or not, what will really satisfy, whether we realize it or not, is not a particular circumstance, but rather the attitude of non-doership, or the dissolving of the attitude of doership and attachment to outcome, which means in practical terms, unbroken peace of mind.
Thinking of programming artificial intelligence, thinking of a device that functions a result of artificial intelligence. I'm having a question. I'm thinking, what possibility is there that a device functioning with artificial intelligence could have peace of mind? I'm thinking for artificial intelligence, it's a non-entity.
Well, this is a bit of an assumption in a way.
Or that, yes.
So, you know, the thing is that we don't really understand the self particularly well, and I would talk about enlightened people. I don't think, or what is referred to enlightened people, right? People who talk about the self. To be frank, I don't believe or know that we know the self beyond what is necessary to have peace of mind. And really, I think that when peace of mind sets in, more likely what has happened is that certain functions of thought have fallen away, because teachings have, and our contemplation has undermined that that part of the program. And we then maybe think we know what the self is. But from my standpoint, I say I don't, and it's not necessary to in order to have peace of mind from my experience. And as I remain open to seeing that there are a lot of areas that I have no idea about, that the idea that a self can't arise within a computer because of certain computations. Now, you know, that idea, I can understand why most people would think that's absolutely ludicrous. I don't think it's ludicrous at all. You know, it will seem ludicrous to someone who thinks they understand the self. And the funny thing is that there's a critical thinking error known as the Dunning-Kruger error. And it's basically people who don't know very much who think they know a lot about a subject. And I think people who draw the conclusion that a sense of self, either the false sense of self or what we refer to as the true sense of self, someone who's convinced that that can't be an output of a computation probably knows very little about computation and computers and very little about the self, and think that they know a lot about the self. Maybe they might think they know a lot about computers. My guess is they don't know much about either, because Well, because we don't know much about these things, who knows what's capable, what's possible. And, it's hypothesized that this in itself is a dream or a simulation, and the sense of self is here. And so maybe the sense of self is a result of the dream or the simulation. Now, there's many hypotheses that, or schools of thought within the simulation theory or the dream theory that suppose a consciousness outside of the simulation or the dream that is inserted into the simulation of the dream. And therefore that means that the consciousness or awareness is not a computation of the simulation, but rather sort of an external factor. If we believe these models and think, yes, that matches my experience, I think we're making a big mistake. And I'm sure there'll be plenty of people that disagree with me, but essentially I'm very open to the fact that the sense of self, both the small self and the capital S self, may in fact be reproducible as a matter of computation. They may not be, but I definitely don't rule it out. And I don't mean, I haven't ruled it out. There's a 1 in a million or 1 in a billion chance that can happen. I wouldn't be surprised if that is what is happening.
I was initially resisting your suggestion, thinking this space of void that has something present, whatever that is not programmable. It's too infinite. But as you were talking, I had a sense of infinite unfolding and infolding and unfolding and infolding and unfolding, just infinitely. And I'm okay with, I'm good with, I think that hopefully just knocked out another Don Krugerism.
Remember, what we think is infinite might not be infinite. What appears infinite might be quite finite, but appearing as infinite.
There's a hair twister. Switching, if I could, onto the subject of books, literature, and authors. More lately, I read, and maybe even just since I've known you, it seems so much that of what's called literature, particularly that which is written over, well, not so recent perhaps, reads, sometimes just reads as if someone is quite awake, quite clear, but telling the story through whatever circumstance they're creating as their literature. It just surprises me at how much taking the words as pointers point me to feeling as though there was some great clarity in some of the great authors. And I was just wondering, do you read much, or in any of your reading, do you experience that as well?
I do. The phenomena you talk about, I think, is very explainable, and I think it includes, or I think a lot of the literary works do have understanding in them. And the reason behind that, I don't know that it's necessarily total understanding, but I think it's understanding in the moment that inspires the writing. So, you know, these shifts, these changes that we have that present as insights, and there's very many of them, progressive sort of insights and progressive change that tends to follow a fairly common pattern of change. One thing follows another, and so even when one part of the process, even if it's fairly high up the ladder in terms of, i.e., or low down the ladder in terms of the totality of change that can happen, when someone awakens to that part or that change, even if there's much more change to happen, there's a profundity in that realization. And because it's so profound, I think that becomes a good topic to write about. And so writers who are naturally creative, that then have those insights, will, you know, that will be food for their next piece of writing. And the words sort of, I think, come out of that insight. And so when we read it, it resonates. It can either resonate because of something we've gone through, or it can resonate because it's exactly what we need to feed us on that part of the change process. And so I think there are a lot of people in history that are writers that have had these awakenings, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they are completely free of suffering, but they're definitely on that movement. And so, yeah, a lot of what we write is inspired by insight. A lot of what we read, should I say, is inspired by insight.
Yeah, that might be an appropriate slip. Much of what we write.
Yeah.
The writer is the reader. Any particular literature that you have enjoyed, or maybe just recently?
I haven't written.
No, I like it.
I haven't read anything for years, and but having said that, I spent 4 or 5 years just reading and reading and reading, but it was very much within this. There is I don't know. It's not so related. A Journey of Kings, I think it's called, by. It's a science fiction, fantasy, science. What's it called? Like a science fantasy
Sci-fi?
or anyway.
Oh, okay.
The Way of Kings, I think it's called. That's right. I thought that was great. Saracen or Sanderson, I think, was
Okay.
the author. Brandon Saracen, I think. So, all right. Well, thanks for dropping in, Mark.
Thank you for being here. I love you.
Pleasure. Love you too. I seem to love everyone. Everyone loves everyone today. It's very, very nice.